Now, one of the topics of discussion that has been a big one here is rangeland management, as managers continue to have a unique understanding of how rangeland management practices continue to impact the communities around here, as well as soil health. We're able to catch up with UNO Range and Forage Management Specialist, that is Dr. Mitch Stephenson, to find out all about what he shared as part of his presentation here at the open house. It's not just about the rangeland studies, but also some different research they can do with the cattle that occupy that land.
Well, Mitch, I'm curious to learn about some of the research you've done as part of your time at the University of Nebraska out here at the Goodmanson Sandhills Laboratory, in particular over the past couple of years. What have you been busy with?
Such a great resource out here to do research on. It's just such a pleasure to be out here able to test some of these things. And so we've had a few different projects that have happened over the last few years that have revolved around precision livestock management, evaluating some grazing strategies on sub-irrigated sandhills meadows, and then tracking the long-term plant biomass with our long-term grazing exposure cages. So the precision livestock management work that we've done out here has revolved mostly around virtual fence. So really that technology has been around for quite a while, since the early 2000s. There's some research papers that have talked about it, but at a commercial scale for cattle, it's really just coming onto the market where people can purchase these collars at larger numbers. And so we've been doing some research in that space for a couple of years now, looking at its efficacy, but also evaluating things on how does this affect cattle stress, how does this affect where they graze, and how that behavior happens. And we just wrapped up a study looking at heart rate, tracking the heart rate of animals as they interact with both the audio and the electric cues of those systems, those collars that they have. And we found that they were fairly effective in keeping cattle where they were at, and that once cattle really get to learn what those cues are signifying, they're able to, one, have fewer electric cues and respond more to audio cues, but two, that their heart rates, while they do elevate, typically that elevation is for a relatively short period. We generally saw 30 seconds. The longest was about 4 minutes without that cow stayed within an electric cueing zone for a little bit longer. And so our conclusions were that it can be an effective tool to keep cattle in. It's not going to be 100% all the time. So you probably want a good perimeter fence, but that it can be effective in managing where they graze, and that the likelihood that it causes long-term stress is probably fairly low, in that cattle, once they know what that is, might have short-term elevated stress, but it goes down relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. As far as the meadow research that we've been doing up here, there's a long history of research looking at different grazing strategies on meadows and uplands here at the Goodmanson Sandhills Lab, and how to incorporate both haying and grazing within those systems. Sandhills meadows are extremely important to our ecosystem. Around 10% of the land area out here, highly productive, important for wildlife and a number of other ecosystem services. And so how do we graze those to get the most benefit from a production standpoint, but also maintain some of those ecological values that they have? And so what we were looking at is how does timing of grazing and intensity of grazing on hay meadow regrowth affect subsequent year hay production? And so we looked at a couple different grazing strategies of grazing either in the fall when grass was still green and growing, or waiting until the winter and after grass had been dormant. Then we looked at a heavy and moderate grazing intensity on that. And really what we found is that the following year, timing tended to have more of an influence than intensity of grazing. And so grazing in the fall, when grasses were still green and growing, tended to reduce subsequent year hay production by about 10% compared to waiting and grazing during the winter time after grasses had gone completely dormant. But there was some trade-offs there. Grazing in the fall, we had more biomass as well as a much higher quality of forage available. And so thinking of that in terms of those trade-offs, grazing is an important benefit in the fall and the winter, and there might be some opportunities that you can rotate that would help so you don't lose as much of that grass production later that next summer. And then lastly, our long-term biomass. We've collected data here since 2004 to basically track how different precipitation, temperature, other weather variables affect our plant production in the uplands sandhills. And so we have a pretty rich data set there. We're learning more and more about how dynamic that is going through these drought and wet cycles. as well as more and more about how the interplay between our C3 cool season grasses and our warm season grasses interact with one another in terms of certain wet years and dry year conditions. And so we continue to do that. This year, we've had decent precipitation. It's looking to be a fairly average year in terms of our production. That long-term data set's been pretty valuable in helping us understand the plant community out here better.
What's the next step after you do these kinds of research projects? And I guess kind of the question becomes, why is it important you're doing so? How can you extend that information out to the producers, a lot of them here today that need that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we try to be is producer focused, try to get after the questions that we're getting calls about and we're getting asked about. And so we try to get this data obviously here at the open house to try to share what we're learning and to ask producers really like what are questions that you have and better ways can we understand this. And so with the virtual fence, we get a lot of calls about that. It's new technology, so a lot of people have questions like, is this working right, or what the cost is and those types of things. So it allows us to really answer some of those questions or give them some direction on that. The long-term biomass data set that we have, that's always a perennial question, right? Is where am I at in terms of my forage production? Do I need to destock or keep, are we going to be okay this year? And so it helps us better create models that we can better pinpoint that this might be going into a drought year based on things like Eric Hunt's talking about today and the weather. That we can then say this is how it relates to our plant biomass. And then these long-term grazing strategy studies are really what we need to do to see what long-term effects certain types of grazing is. And so ranches like the Goodmanson Sandhills labs are critical to that research because we try to make them as close to a production scale or a production type operation here in the Sandhills. So the hope is that data, that research, that information that we get can be directly related to what a rancher is facing day to day and can tie into how they make the decisions on their operation.
Important work. Thanks for shedding a light on it, Mitch. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it being here.